Hi guys, welcome to the first interview of Capturing Christianity. Today I have Dr. Tyler McNabb here with me, and we are going to be discussing some really interesting topics today. So we're going to go ahead and start right off on it. And Tyler, if you can just tell me a little bit about your story, how you got involved in philosophy, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So it roughly started when I was about 16. I was a senior in high school, and I began to have a lot of doubts about God's existence. And I became really worried that God didn't exist, and what I thought the most plausible explanation of that, if God didn't exist, would be something like that nihilism is true, right? The idea that there, at least moral nihilism, the idea that there is no such things as objective moral values, duties, meaning, and so forth. And so I was pretty much willing to become a moral nihilist if I didn't find evidence that God existed. I ended up coming across passages in the Old Testament, like Isaiah 53, that really encouraged me, or as Plantinga would say, sort of just found myself believing that this is Jesus here. And for the first time in my life, I felt the Holy Spirit. I felt the presence of God just fill me up for the first time. So this was
during reading the Bible, right?
That's right.
So reading Isaiah, and you just felt
really compelled, like this is Jesus.
Okay.
Daniel 9:24-26, some other passages like that, like this has to be Jesus. This is Jesus. And just felt really compelled to believe in Jesus. And God used this opportunity as a time to really present himself and more of a sort of an experiential way to me, and believe the gospel, and my life changed radically. To fast forward things up a little bit quicker, I ended up going to college to do a degree in biblical studies, and I ended up picking a school that was pretty far on the left, and I didn't realize that as a new believer. And so all of a sudden, I was put in a situation where I had to do apologetics and rely on apologetics, even at a Christian college.
And so by that you mean like discussing with other people, other students?
The professors, actually. So a lot of the students were kind of just like eating whatever the professor said, or I want a good grade, so I'm just not going to challenge the professor whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I'll just do what I need to do to get out of here. And all of a sudden, when you start saying things like Jesus never resurrected, or we can't know that God exists, right, at a Christian college, I wasn't willing to do that. I wanted to get in and engage, and so I found resources, certain tools, apologetic tools. Actually, Michael Brown, the well-known apologist in regard to Jewish objections to Jesus. Mm-hmm. That was one of the big works that I sort of first devoured since I came to faith by way of sort of messianic prophecies. So I really sort of got into do this. It wasn't too long after that someone introduced me to a philosopher named Greg Bahnsen, and it was for sort of more of this philosophical route to doing apologetics. And that really sort of lit a fire in me, and ended up coming across guys like William Lane Craig, who's now my colleague here at HBU, and ended up just falling in love with philosophy, Christian philosophy specifically, and that's how I sort of got into doing philosophy.
Okay, so tell me about your story with Alvin Planting. How did that kind of start? Because you're sort of known, I guess, among Christian apologists and stuff for being a very, very big proponent of Plantinga's epistemology and
that's right, or truth, as I like to call it. Slight joke, but only slight. So upon coming to faith and upon sort of getting into apologetics, something I quickly left out. There was about a year afterwards where all of a sudden, after I've been grounded in my faith for a couple of years, these doubts just came racing back, and it started really affecting me existentially. And the idea is, well, here are all these good arguments, right? I was a hard evidentialist, right? You need good arguments. You need propositional evidence to justify your belief. And I thought that I had good arguments, and still to this day I think there are really good arguments for God's existence. But I was like, what if someone smarter comes along and shows me that, in fact, my argument goes wrong because, some sort of counterexample to a premise or something like that. And it just got me really worried. It was like, wow, upon encountering one person, and I was trying to engage skeptics at the time, so I was engaging unbelief at a very high rate, and so upon thinking that, hey, I could spend my whole life doing ministry, and then one person comes along and shows me that the couple of arguments I was really relying on to justify my faith are actually not good arguments. And so I could be no longer justified in my faith, and thus no longer know that Jesus was raised from the dead. And this burden just hit me hard, and it was really screwing me up for quite a bit of time. Finally, when I got to graduate school, I ended up doing an MA in philosophy of religion, and I ended up reading Alvin Plantinga's Warranted Christian Belief. And the whole thesis of the book is that we can know that God exists apart from argumentation. We can be warranted in our belief that God exists apart from arguments. And then there's sort of this defense of trusting our natural inclinations, our natural intuitions, our trusting our seemings, especially those in which are strong. And so
during this time in your life, this I guess if you want to say, this really appealed to you.
That's right.
You're wanting to look for ways out of this existential threat.
That's right.
So you're
absolutely.
So Plantinga was a knight in shining armor almost.
That's right. And so I was like, this stuff, this is the good stuff right here, and I want to spend my career defending it. And so, in large part, since I don't know how many years ago that was, but since those years, that's what I've been doing.
Cool.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about how far you've gone into it, because you've written papers defending Alvin Plantinga, and so why don't we just walk through some of those papers, some of your ideas, just get a little bit deeper into what Reformed Epistemology is, and then maybe some common objections and that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, so I ended up doing a PhD thesis on it, and since then I've had half a dozen or so papers published on the topic. I take it roughly that the thesis of Reformed Epistemology is that belief in God can be warranted apart from argumentation, or justified, if you want to go that route, apart from argumentation. That's roughly the thesis, I think. Plantinga has a particular way in which he demonstrates this, and he has a method called, a theory of warrant called proper functionalism. So proper functionalism is roughly the thesis that in order for a person's belief to be warranted, that belief needs to be produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties, and the environment for which those cognitive faculties were designed for, those faculties need to be aimed at truth, and there needs to be a high objective probability that the belief produced under these conditions indeed would be true. And so those conditions, roughly these conditions, you might have slight addendums here and there, depending on which proper functionalist you talk about. But roughly, we'll call this sort of the bare minimum proper functionalist constraints. And as long as these are there, or as long as these are in play, as my belief is produced as a result of these conditions being in place, then my belief is warranted. And that means that I don't necessarily have to have an argument for my belief in order for my belief to be warranted, if the design plan doesn't designate that an argument is necessary. So let's take ordinary, mundane beliefs, right? So let's. A lot of philosophers think that belief in other minds isn't a belief that there's really good arguments for. So let's go ahead and for a moment concede that. Let's go ahead and say there aren't actually really good arguments for the belief that other minds exist.
Okay.
Now, are we going to say that we're not rational believing in other minds? Of course not. It's quite common sense to think that to think that belief in other minds is a rational belief to have. In fact, if you came to me and you said you didn't believe in other minds that existed, that you were the only mind that existed, I would question your sanity. And so, well, how can this belief be rational? How can it be warranted? All right. Well, hey, if we're sort of designed, we're sort of programmed to produce the belief in other minds, and that there are other minds around us, and our faculties are functioning properly, aimed toward truth, and there's a high objective probability that the belief being produced under these conditions would be true, well then, hey, my belief would be warranted even if I didn't have a good argument. Same thing, how do you justify that there's an external world? or that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, right, and certain memories. Well, you can use proper functionalism and to sort of respond to these skeptical arguments or these sort of skeptical scenarios in this way. And so all what Plantinga then does, so he has a trilogy, the Warrant Trilogy, Warrant the Contemporary Debate, Warrant Proper Function, and Warranted Christian Belief. And he spends the second book, Warrant Proper Function, just sort of doing this exact thing, going through beliefs that are typically targeted by skeptics and sort of saying how there's a really good answer to these sort of skeptical scenarios by way of postulating proper functionalism. And then he spends so he tries to sort of make proper functionalism plausible this way. And then in his third volume, Warranted Christian Belief, he then just applies it to theistic belief.
But then not only theistic belief, he does that, I think, originally.
Yeah.
But then he goes and develops it further to cover sort of all the Christian beliefs that are involved in the Bible and Christianity and everything. So
yeah, that's right. So you have what he calls the AC model and the extended AC model. AC standing for Aquinas Calvin. So you have this sort of bare minimum Aquinas Calvin model and this more extended, robust Aquinas Calvin model. The sort of former of these, the more basic, the classic AC model, if we want to call it, goes something like this. If God exists and He's designed our faculties to produce the belief that He exists or that He's doing some sort of activity, and our faculties are functioning properly and aimed toward truth when my belief is produced, then my belief is warranted, even if I don't have an argument. So it's this idea that we have what Calvin calls the sensus divinitatis, the sense of divinity, the sense of divine. That there is part of our cognitive structure, there is this faculty, this ability that is aimed at producing theistic belief. Interestingly enough, for any skeptics watching out there, the mainstream view currently within the field of cognitive science of religion, CSR, is that belief in God is an evolutionary spandrel, that it is something that's sort of basic to our cognitive structure. It's something very natural. We are all sort of natural theists, so it meshes quite well with science. But then there's the extended AC model, and roughly the extended AC model assumes that maybe there's something like sin that has entered into the world, that has sort of messed up our sense of divinity, our sensus divinitatis, and it needs to be repaired. It needs repairment. And so the idea is that it's possible that the Holy Spirit, the third member of the Trinity, exists, and He's sort of in the midst of repairing this sensus divinitatis, and in doing so, sort of instigating us, moving us to believe the gospel truths. So perhaps someone is being testified to of the gospel truths. Maybe they're hearing a street preacher or a pastor or a friend or their parents. Or
they're just reading the Bible.
Reading the Bible. And they feel all of a sudden like really strongly inclined to accept the testimony that's at hand.
Which is sort of your own experience, right? When you were reading Isaiah,
that's right.
You had this experience. And so it's the same kind of experience, not this fairy tale experience that no one has.
That's right.
Right? It's something that I think a lot of people would identify with.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And so if the idea is that it's epistemically possible, that's to say, as far as we know, it could be the case. The Spirit of God exists. He's repairing my faculties, instigating me to believe, and I'm sort of just naturally inclined to accept this gospel testimony.
And so this would also explain why there's so much religious diversity, right? That's the sin. So sin, and then the fact that the Holy Spirit is sort of attempting to fix those cognitive faculties, right? But in a sense, we can still deny the Holy Spirit. I think Plantinga says that the Holy Spirit is a gentleman. Right? He's not going to force himself on people. And so just a little bit more on that. So I know that Stephen Law objects to this view in the way that he says, we shouldn't really rely on our cognitive faculties with regard to religious beliefs because they produce so many different versions, so many different kinds. And so we shouldn't really rely on that cognitive faculty. See, it just seems so unreliable. So how would you respond to that?
So Stephen Law argues that we have a defeat for trusting that our sensus divinitatis is reliable. And he goes back to cognitive science and shows that the sensus divinitatis, that the faculty that's responsible for producing theistic belief is also responsible for producing belief in fairies and in psychic Sally and sort of the supernatural, phenomena, as well as you mentioned, sort of diverse religious beliefs. And so he thinks that being that it produces belief in things that we all think are false or silly, that we should also then think that we should also be skeptical that our belief that God exists is indeed reliable as well. So I respond to how I responded to him in our debate, and how I'm responding to him in a forthcoming paper that will be out later this year, is something like this. So in philosophy, there's something called seemings. So a seeming is where something seems that way to you, sort of like this experience that can justify your belief under certain conditions. And so I think that that my belief that my sensus divinitatis is reliable can still be justified, given that I have a very strong seeming that it is. When I go out into nature and I see the starry skies and the beautiful waves crashing against each other, I am at awe, and I still find myself thinking like, God exists, He created this. Or when I come home from work after a busy and hard day of work, my children run up to me and I grab them in my arms and they're like, "Daddy!" And I just find myself thinking like, of course God exists. Yes, He exists. It just seems so apparent to me, so obvious. There are fewer things that seem as obvious as that. And so this sort of non-propositional evidence, this sort of experience.
So let's make that distinction. So on the one hand, you have propositional evidence.
Yeah.
And so that would be something like Stephen Law's argument.
Yeah, so you have propositional evidence, which is evidence that depends on other propositions, and then you have non-propositional evidence that doesn't depend on other propositions. And so this sort of experience that I have isn't based off of other propositions. It's not based on an argument, as Law's defeater is based on. And sometimes sort of this non-propositional evidence can outweigh or overwhelm the considerations of the propositional evidence that you're also considering. And so it's roughly the idea that even after reflecting on Law's proposed defeater, even if I take that into account with my total evidence, my non-propositional evidence is such that it's still going to be rational for me to form the belief that God exists.
And so how do you suspect that Law would respond to something like that?
I think in the debate, I think there was mention of being brainwashed, something like that.
What do you mean? So he was saying that you're brainwashed, or?
Well, the host of the debate, I think, might have provoked this, but yeah, the idea is that I think I haven't listened to it since it came out, but I think he mentioned something like people who just can't who doxastically speaking can't be moved upon hearing such a rational line of evidence as his own evidence for the feasibility of my sensus divinitatis are analogous to individuals who I guess are just brainwashed or something like that. So,
okay.
And then he would even feel pity on me in some sense. So I mean, that's the sort of thing. Well, philosophers do this all the time. Philosophers appeal to non-propositional evidence all the time, even when it's not in favor of theism. So for example, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but there's Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, which basically just sort of the opposite. It sort of questions the naturalist cognitive faculties on the grounds that if atheism were true. And Michael Bergman, who's a proper functionalist of sorts, actually argues that we can use non-propositional evidence, or the naturalists can use non-propositional evidence, to sort of deflect Plantinga's attempted defeater. And so philosophers do this all the time. They appeal to non-propositional evidence. It's nothing that I'm doing in some sort of special case or something like that.